I still remember the way the light hit the hospital room when Leo was born. My husband, Mark, was holding my hand so tight, I thought my bones might snap. We had waited 3 years for this. 3 years of negative tests, quiet tears into pillows, and the heavy, suffocating silence of an empty nursery. When the nurse finally placed that warm, squirming bundle on my chest, I felt like the world had finally started spinning again. I looked up at Mark, and for a second, everything was perfect. Then I saw her. My mother-in-law, Evelyn, was standing in the doorway. She wasn't smiling. She was staring at my son's face with a squint that felt like a surgical laser. Evelyn has always been a woman of high standards and low tolerance. She comes from old money, the kind that smells like cedarwood and judgment. To her, I was always the girl from the wrong side of the tracks who managed to snag her golden boy. I spent years trying to win her over. I baked the pies. I remembered the birthdays. I sat through her endless lectures on etiquette. I thought having a grandson would finally soften the ice around her heart. But as she walked toward the bed, she didn't look at me. She leaned over Leo, touched his hair, which was dark, unlike Mark's sandy blonde, and whispered, "He doesn't look much like a thorn, does he?" That was the moment everything changed. The joy in the room evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling tension. Mark laughed it off, telling his mother that babies change every day, but I saw the seed she had planted. Evelyn didn't just value family, she valued purity. She talked about the Thorne lineage as if they were royalty, and I was a commoner who might dilute the bloodline. I brushed it off as her usual bitterness, but the way she lingered over Leo's features made my skin crawl. I didn't know then that she was already planning her move. For the first few months, I lived in a haze of sleep deprivation and maternal bliss. Mark was a good father, mostly, but Evelyn was always there. She was a shadow in our living room, a ghost in our kitchen. She would show up unannounced with advice that felt more like a cross-examination. "Are you sure he's eating enough, Clara? He looks so different from how Mark looked at this age." Or, "It's funny how he has those hazel eyes. No one in our family has hazel eyes." I felt invisible in my own home, a mere vessel for a child she was constantly scrutinizing. I trusted them. I trusted my husband when he told me his mother was just being eccentric. I trusted the walls of my home to keep us safe. But the atmosphere was shifting. Mark started looking at Leo differently. He would stare at the baby while he was sleeping, not with love, but with a question mark behind his eyes. The comments from Evelyn were working. She was dripping poison into his ear when I wasn't in the room, and I could feel the distance growing between us like a physical chasm. I was the outsider again, the girl who didn't belong. The breaking point happened on a Tuesday. I had gone to the grocery store, leaving Leo with Mark and Evelyn for just an hour. When I came home, the house was silent. Too silent. I found them in the nursery. Evelyn was holding a small plastic bag, and Mark was looking at the floor, his face pale. They didn't hear me come in. I watched as Evelyn tucked a stray hair, a tiny dark hair from my son's head, into a collection kit. My heart stopped. I realized they weren't just questioning me, they were investigating me. I stood in the doorway, the bags of groceries heavy in my hands, feeling the world tilt on its axis. I wanted to scream, to throw the glass jars of baby food at the walls, to demand they leave. But a cold, hard clarity washed over me. I realized that if I fought them now, I would lose. They had the money, the influence, and the shared history. I was just the wife. I realized that in their eyes, I wasn't a mother. I was a suspect. I backed away quietly, making sure the floorboards didn't creak. I went back to the front door, slammed it, and shouted, "I'm home," as if I hadn't seen a thing. The betrayal tasted like copper in my mouth. For the next week, I watched them. I watched the way they exchanged looks over the dinner table. I watched Mark struggle to meet my eyes. He was waiting for the results. He had allowed his mother to violate our son's privacy, to treat me like a common liar, all because he didn't have the spine to stand up to her. Every time he kissed me, I felt a wave of nausea. Every time Evelyn smiled at me, I saw the predator behind the pearls. They thought I wouldn't fight back. They thought I was too weak, too dependent, too common to understand the game they were playing. I felt like I was living in a horror movie where the monsters were the people who were supposed to love me. I would lie awake at night, listening to Mark's steady breathing, wondering how he could sleep while he was waiting for a piece of paper to tell him if his son was legitimate. The betrayal wasn't just the DNA test. It was the fact that he didn't believe in me. He didn't believe in us. I was a stranger in my own bed, a ghost in my own life. I realized then that my marriage wasn't a partnership. It was a probationary period that Evelyn was presiding over. I decided to do some investigating of my own. If DNA was the only language the Thorns spoke, then I would learn to speak it fluently. I started digging through the attic, looking through old boxes of Evelyn's things while she was out at her bridge club. I found old letters, photos, and legal documents. I found a gap in the family history that didn't make sense. Evelyn always bragged about her pure Thorn heritage, but the dates on certain documents didn't align with the stories she told. A suspicion began to form, a dark, jagged thought that I almost didn't want to believe. While I was searching, I found the receipt for the DNA test she had ordered for Leo. It was hidden in her desk in the study. She had used a private lab, paying extra for a rush result. My hands shook as I held that piece of paper. She was so confident that I was the one with the secret. She was so sure that I had brought tainted blood into her family. I took a deep breath and realized that if I was going to survive this, I had to stop playing defense. I had to go on the offensive. I didn't stop at Leo's test. I needed more. I waited until Evelyn came over for dinner the following Sunday. I was the perfect hostess. I served her favorite roast, laughed at her dry jokes, and kept her wine glass full. When she went to the bathroom, I followed her, not into the room, but to the vanity she had used to freshen up. I found her hairbrush in her purse, which she'd left on the hallway bench. I pulled 3 long silver strands from the bristles and tucked them into a sterile envelope I had hidden in my pocket. I felt a surge of adrenaline, so strong it made my teeth ache. The next few days were a blur of calculated moves. I sent Evelyn's samples to the same lab she had used for Leo, requesting a full genealogical breakdown. I used my maiden name and a burner email address. While I waited, I had to play the part of the grieving, confused wife. Mark finally broke down and told me about the test he'd done with his mother. He cried. He apologized. He said he just needed to be sure because of the things his mother had said. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just looked at him and said, "I understand, Mark." Truly, he thought I was forgiving him. He had no idea I was mourning him. The results for Leo came back first. Mark showed them to me with a look of immense relief, as if he expected me to celebrate that the test proved he was the father. "See, Clara, you're 100% the mother, and I'm 100% the father. We can put this behind us now." I looked at the paper. I looked at the man I had married. "You needed a laboratory to tell you that I didn't cheat on you?" I asked quietly. He tried to hug me, but I stepped back. The damage was done. He had looked at our son and seen a lie. He didn't deserve the truth I was about to uncover. 2 days later, my burner phone buzzed. The results for Evelyn were ready. I opened the PDF in the parking lot of a park miles away from the Thorn estate. I scrolled past the technical jargon and landed on the ancestry breakdown and the biological markers. My breath hitched. The pure Thorn lineage was a lie. Not just a small lie, but a monumental, decades-old fabrication. Evelyn wasn't who she said she was. More importantly, she wasn't biologically related to the family that gave her that old money status. I sat in my car, laughing until I started to cry. The woman who had spent years belittling my background, who had tested my son's blood to see if he was worthy of her name, was a complete fraud. She had spent her entire life building a fortress of lies, and I now held the key to the front door. I realized that Evelyn's obsession with Leo's DNA wasn't just about me. It was about her own deep-seated fear of being found out. She was projecting her own illegitimacy onto my innocent child. I spent the next week meticulously planning my comeback. I didn't want a private confrontation. Evelyn thrived in the shadows, in the whispered comments and the subtle snubs. If I was going to take her down, I had to do it where she was most vulnerable, in front of everyone she spent her life trying to impress. The Thorns were hosting their annual Founders Gala that Saturday. It was a black-tie event filled with the city's elite. It was the perfect stage for a public execution. I bought a dress that cost more than my first car, a deep, blood-red silk that made me look like a queen. I did my hair, my makeup, and I put on the Thorn family diamonds that Evelyn had graciously lent me for the evening. When Mark saw me, his jaw dropped. He thought I was trying to win his mother over one last time. He thought I was finally conforming to their world. I just smiled at him, a cold, sharp smile that didn't reach my eyes. Tonight is going to be unforgettable, I told him. The gala was held at the Historical Society, a building filled with portraits of dead men who looked just like the pure Thorn lineage Evelyn loved to talk about. The room was filled with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. Evelyn was in her element, holding court near the grand staircase. She was wearing a crown-like headpiece, looking every bit the matriarch. I watched her for a moment, feeling a strange sense of pity. She had no idea that her world was about to end. I waited until the middle of the evening, when the speeches were about to begin. The room fell silent as the chairman of the society stood up to thank the Thorns for their continued legacy. I didn't wait for him to finish. I walked up to the podium, my heels clicking like a countdown on the marble floor. Mark tried to grab my arm, but I brushed him off. I took the microphone, and the room went dead silent. Evelyn's face went from confusion to a mask of sheer terror as she saw the envelope in my hand. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice steady and clear. "As many of you know, the Thorns value one thing above all else: legacy. My mother-in-law, Evelyn, has taught me a lot about the importance of family truth lately. In fact, she was so concerned about the purity of the Thorn line that she took the liberty of DNA testing my newborn son behind my back." A collective gasp rippled through the room. I saw Mark put his head in his hands. Evelyn stood frozen, her face turning a ghastly shade of gray. I was hurt at first. I continued, but then I realized Evelyn was right. We should all want the truth. So, I decided to follow her lead. I did a little testing of my own. I wanted to make sure I was living up to the high standards of this family. I opened the envelope and pulled out the charts. I didn't just read them. I projected them onto the large screen behind the podium that was being used for the society's slideshow. This is Evelyn Thorn's biological profile. It turns out Evelyn has no genetic connection to the Thorn family. She isn't the heiress she claims to be. In fact, her father wasn't a Thorn at all. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of 100 social lives ending at once. Evelyn tried to speak, but only a dry, wheezing sound came out. She looked around the room, seeing the shocked faces of her peers, the people she had looked down on for decades. Her secret was out. The commoner she had tried to destroy had dismantled her entire identity in less than 3 minutes. I looked down at her from the podium, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I think we're done with the illusions, I said into the microphone. I walked down the steps past the stunned guests and straight to Mark. He looked at me with a mixture of horror and realization. He finally saw the woman he had betrayed, not a victim, but a survivor who was done being silent. I didn't wait for him to speak. I didn't need his apology anymore. I had something better. I had my self-respect. I walked out of that hall and into the cool night air. The weight that had been sitting on my chest for years was gone. I knew the fallout would be massive. There would be lawyers, a divorce, and a scandal that would dominate the headlines for months. Evelyn's life was over, and Mark's life was changed forever. But as I got into my car and drove toward the house where my son was sleeping, I didn't feel a single ounce of regret. I realized that I didn't need their name or their money to be whole. I had spent so long trying to fit into a family that was built on a foundation of sand and lies. I had let them make me feel small so they could feel big. Never again. I was going to raise Leo to know that his value didn't come from a bloodline or a DNA test, but from the truth of who he was. The drive home was the most peaceful moment of my life. I knew I was leaving everything behind. The house, the status, the man who didn't fight for me. It was a terrifying thought, but also the most liberating one I'd ever had. I was starting over, but this time I was starting with the truth. As I pulled into the driveway and saw the light on in Leo's nursery, I smiled. Sometimes losing your family is the price of finding yourself.